Most people today, sadly, when they think of Islam, especially in the United States, they have still these negative connotations because they haven't had the experience of the unique experience of the Gulen movement. In today's world, it's absolutely essential that we engage Muslims and Christians particularly, but Muslims and Jews, Muslims and everyone else, engage in interreligious dialogue. My name is Father Alexei. I'm a Catholic priest, and I'm not only a pastor of a congregation here, parish here in Los Angeles, but I also work for the Archdiocese as the ecumenical and interreligious officer for the Archdiocese. What does that mean? That means I direct the Catholic Church's relations with all other faiths here in Los Angeles, both ecumenically with our fellow Christians and interreligiously with non-Christians. Pope Francis, in his recent apostolic exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel, speaks in a certain section of that document on interreligious dialogue. And he points out specifically things about Islam and things about Judaism. And in the section about Islam, he talks about authentic Islam, an Islam which would abhor violence and be open to dialogue. And this is precisely what I see in the Hizmet movement, and certainly in my readings of the teachings of Fethullah Gulen. My understanding that Hizmet means in Turkish service, right? And that's one of the things I really appreciate about the movement, is the amount of service you do, not only to your fellow Muslims, but to all of us. And the whole aspect then of interreligious dialogue, and certainly education and learning. Interreligious dialogue is absolutely essential today in all parts of the world. It's important that we learn about each other and learn from each other. I read in, I think it's in Mr. Gulen's book, Faith and Tolerance. I was intrigued by the, love and tolerance. I don't usually use the word tolerance. For me, tolerance is a negative term, meaning I'll put up with you. But that's not the way that I've come to understand Mr. Gulen uses the term tolerance. He talks about let your heart be as tolerant as the wide open ocean. And that indicates to me an openness to allowing the other to enrich you as you enrich them. And that's the perfect definition, I think, of interreligious dialogue. And I certainly see this as a prominent feature of his teachings. And then certainly learning. I'm a great advocate of interreligious learning, where we learn from one another. You as a Muslim learn from me as a Catholic. I as a Catholic learn from you as a Muslim. And this is where certainly all of the vast network of schools sponsored by the Hizmet movement come into play so wonderfully. I think that Hizmet, amongst the Islamic organizations, movements and such, seems to epitomize that triangle or that triad of service, dialogue, and education. I very much have appreciated my visits with your charitable organizations there in Turkey itself, and to learn how the Hizmet movement has taken its mouth, if you will, and put it into action in service to others throughout the world. In Haiti, which is a Catholic country after the tremendous earthquake there, the amount of service that you rendered there. That's a stellar example of people of different religions recognizing the basic humanity of one another, setting aside religious differences, concentrating on working together for the betterment of humanity. Look at the Philippines, where you have schools where there are sometimes misunderstandings between Catholics and Muslims there. But when you have Catholics and Muslims studying together in the same school, learning about each other from each other, this is very hopeful for the future. And that's what I see the Hizmet movement, bringing hope. Most people today, sadly, when they think of Islam, especially in the United States, they have still these negative connotations because they haven't had the experience of the unique experience of the Gulen movement. In today's world, it's absolutely essential that we engage Muslims and Christians particularly, but Muslims and Jews, Muslims and everyone else, engage in interreligious dialogue. What is interreligious dialogue? Miroslav Volt, who is a professor at one of the East Coast universities here, speaks of interfaith dialogue as an embrace. What do you do when you embrace someone? You open your arms to put your arms around that person. In opening your arms, you're making room in yourself for the other person. And that's what we all need to do. Doesn't mean that I cease to be a Catholic when I'm involved in interreligious dialogue with a Muslim, or that the Muslim ceases to be Muslim, or that certainly doesn't mean that I'm trying to convert you to Catholicism, nor are you trying to convert me to Islam. We're trying to make room in ourselves for the other, that we might surface those areas of resonance, and certainly there are many points of resonance between Islam and Catholicism, and acknowledge those areas where we differ, and then not permit those areas where we differ to prohibit us from working together for the betterment of society. I very much appreciate Fethullah Gulen's differentiation between a teacher and an educator. I recall reading in one of his books, maybe a couple of his books, that any human being can teach, but the number of those who are truly educators are severely limited. An educator is one who also mentors their students, who spends an extraordinary amount of time with their students, who challenges their students, not merely to parrot back what they learn, but also to expand themselves, to develop their personalities, and to develop values. And all of these things I've seen from my own experience in the Hizmet schools. I would certainly, and do, regret any attempt to curtail or to condemn the Gulen movement, the Hizmet movement's activities, because I look upon them, I look upon Mr. Gulen, I look upon the whole movement's efforts as a shining beacon in the Islamic world, and I've used a beacon of hope for the future. I've seen, and I've used the Hizmet movement as examples when I talk about how we should be, how the Catholic Church should be in dialogue with Islam. I recommend his books in the classes I teach at Mount St. Mary's College, for example, as being reflective of what Pope Francis refers to as authentic Islam. Pope Francis and others within the Catholic Church refer to Mr. Gulen's teachings as authentic Islam. I understand that many of these schools, perhaps even the schools that I've visited and been a part of there in Turkey, are threatened with closure. I think that would be a tragic loss. How can anyone who is educating people and challenging people to the extent that the Gulen movement schools are challenging people to grow, how can that be a threat to anyone who truly loves democracy?
And the problem with most movements is that they wear their piety and religiosity on their sleeve. What the Hizmet movement and Gulen's movement in general is that they act upon what matters rather than talking about what doesn't really matter, in my opinion.
It's a genuine democratic, spontaneous action, not run by one single person or one single group of people, but rather getting people to see the best in themselves and to take that best and dedicate it to the good of all people, not just themselves or not just their local group. That kind of example in the world is tremendously powerful.